The courtroom was packed with spectators, attorneys, and reporters. A palpable tension hung in the air, thick enough that it felt like everyone was holding their breath. The focus of the room was entirely on Ethan, the 18-year-old young man standing before the judge. He looked calm, his expression composed, but his sharp gaze never wavered from the woman seated across from him, his stepmother, Sarah. Sarah sat with an air of cold confidence, her posture straight and unbothered. She had the kind of presence that commanded respect, or at least it seemed that way. To the casual observer, everything about her looked perfect. She was polished, calm, and collected. But to Ethan, she was a lie that was about to be exposed in front of everyone in that room. A lie that had taken years of pain and suffering to finally uncover. Ethan had been silent throughout most of the trial, sitting quietly, watching as his father's attorney and Sarah's defense team traded words. He had listened to the arguments with a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. But now, the moment had come for him to speak. The judge, a middle-aged man named Judge Miller, who had presided over the case with authority, nodded to Ethan. It was his turn. Ethan stood up slowly, the weight of the room's attention on him. He raised his hand and held a small, folded piece of paper. For a moment, he hesitated, letting the silence grow thicker. He knew this moment would change everything. With a steady hand, he unfolded the paper, his eyes never leaving Sarah's. His voice broke the silence. "I know what you did," he said calmly but firmly, his words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. A hush fell over the courtroom. The air seemed to freeze, and everyone turned their attention to Sarah. Her confident exterior faltered, her face turning pale as Ethan's words began to sink in. The room was full of people waiting for the next move, but Sarah said nothing at first. The tension was so thick, it was almost tangible. Ethan continued, raising his voice slightly. "I know everything," he said, folding the paper once more. "I have proof of what you've done to our family. All the lies, all the manipulation. You thought you could hide it, but I know the truth." A gasp rippled through the room, a collective intake of breath from everyone present. Sarah's lawyer quickly leaned toward her, whispering urgently in her ear. She turned her head, eyes flashing with a mixture of panic and disbelief. She had no idea how much Ethan knew, and the realization that he was prepared to expose her for everything she had done was slowly sinking in. Ethan didn't look away. He stood tall, his hands gripping the edge of the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The moment that would bring justice for everything Sarah had done to his family. He wasn't going to back down now. He had come too far. "I have a recording," Ethan said, his voice rising with confidence. "A recording of her confession. She admits to everything. The lies, the manipulation, the money she's stolen from my father." His words were punctuated with a steady breath, but inside, Ethan was shaking. He could see Sarah's face draining of color, the realization hitting her harder than anything he could have imagined. The courtroom was still, the silence almost unbearable. The judge, who had remained a neutral observer, now raised an eyebrow, looking between Ethan and Sarah. "Mr. Ethan, please explain what you mean. What proof do you have?" he asked, his voice firm yet laced with curiosity. The room was on edge, all eyes trained on Ethan, waiting for him to reveal the damning evidence. Ethan took a deep breath and walked forward. He could feel the weight of every single person in that room watching him, waiting for him to speak. He took the recorder from his pocket and held it up. "This," he said, "is a recording of Sarah confessing to everything she's done, to the lies, to the manipulation of my father. to everything. He handed the recorder to the judge, who carefully examined it. "Let's see what we have here," Judge Miller said, signaling to the court's technicians to play the recording. The room seemed to hold its breath as the whirring sound of the recorder filled the space. The voice that came through the speaker was unmistakably Sarah's. "George is too trusting. He'll never notice the missing money," Sarah's voice echoed through the courtroom. "He's always been so naive. As long as he thinks I'm doing everything for him, he'll keep signing the papers. It's just too easy." A ripple of shock ran through the room as Sarah's words continued to play. Ethan's heart pounded as he listened to the confession. The room was in shock. Even Sarah's lawyer, who had been defending her just moments ago, now seemed stunned. He looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and caution. Sarah's face turned crimson, her eyes wide with panic. She looked at the judge, then at her lawyer, as if she was trying to figure out how to stop this, but it was too late. The truth was out in the open now. "Do you recognize that voice, Ms. Sarah?" Judge Miller asked, his tone stern but neutral. "Is this your voice, admitting to these crimes?" Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her face was twisted in shock, but she had no defense. Her lips trembled as she tried to think of something, anything, that could explain what had just been exposed. But she was trapped. Ethan had found the proof. He had found the truth. And now, there was no escaping it. The courtroom was still, as everyone waited for Sarah to react. She glanced at Ethan, her expression a mix of fury and fear, but she said nothing. It was as if the truth had taken away her ability to speak. "Ms. Sarah," Judge Miller prompted again, his patience thinning. "Would you care to respond to this evidence?" Sarah's eyes darted from the judge to Ethan, but she said nothing. She was caught in the lie, and there was no way out. The truth was undeniable. Ethan had done what no one else in the family could do. He had exposed the lies. He had brought the truth to light, no matter the consequences. Ethan stood tall, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had won. The truth was out there, and now it was only a matter of time before Sarah had to face the consequences. The courtroom was silent as Sarah's confession played over the speaker, the weight of her words sinking into everyone present. Ethan stood tall, his heart pounding, but he felt a strange sense of triumph. This was the moment he had been waiting for. For years, he had endured the manipulation, the lies, and the deceit. But now, the truth was out in the open. As the last words of the recording echoed through the room, the tension grew unbearable. Everyone waited for Sarah's response. Ethan's eyes never left her. He had waited too long for this, and now that it was happening, he couldn't look away. Sarah's face was a mask of disbelief and fear. Her lips pressed tightly together as if she were trying to keep the words inside. Her entire world had just crumbled in front of her, and she didn't know how to react. For a moment, there was only silence. Sarah glanced at her lawyer, who seemed as stunned as she was. His hand trembled as he quickly scribbled something on a notepad. He leaned in to whisper in Sarah's ear, but she shook her head violently. She wasn't ready to accept what had just happened. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Sarah stood up abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh sound that shattered the silence in the room. She turned to face Ethan, her eyes narrowed with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think this is enough to ruin me?" Sarah spat, her voice sharp and cutting. "You think that just because you have a recording of me talking about money, you've somehow won? You have no idea what you're doing, Ethan." Her words echoed through the courtroom, but Ethan didn't flinch. He had prepared himself for this moment, the moment when Sarah would try to fight back. He had been expecting her to lash out, to try and turn the tables. But he was ready. He had done his homework, and he knew that the truth was on his side. Sarah's lawyer, realizing the magnitude of the situation, leaned in to whisper something in her ear again, but she ignored him this time. Instead, she glared at Ethan with venom in her eyes. It was as if she could feel the walls closing in around her, but she refused to accept it. "You think you've won, don't you?" Sarah continued, her voice trembling with anger. "But you haven't even begun to understand what you're up against. You think a recording will bring me down? You have no idea how much power I have, how many people are behind me. This isn't over, Ethan. It's far from over." Ethan's pulse quickened. He had expected resistance, but this was something else. Sarah wasn't just trying to deny the truth. She was trying to intimidate him. Her words were a thinly veiled threat, and Ethan could feel the weight of her words like a cold chill in the room. Judge Miller raised his hand, signaling for order. "Ms. Sarah," he said sternly, "please refrain from making threats in my courtroom. If you have a defense to present, now is the time. Otherwise, we will proceed with the case." Sarah's face contorted with fury, but she remained silent. The judge's words seemed to have taken some of the wind out of her sails. Still, she wasn't done. She turned to Ethan, her eyes narrowing as she spoke once more. "This won't end well for you, Ethan," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You've made a big mistake. You think you're protecting your father, but all you're doing is destroying everything we've built. You'll regret this." Ethan could feel the weight of her words, but he refused to let them shake him. He had come too far to be intimidated now. Sarah had used fear and manipulation to control his father for years, but that was over now. He wasn't afraid of her anymore. Not after everything he had uncovered. Not after hearing her confession. "I'm not afraid of you," Ethan said, his voice steady, unwavering. "And I'm not going to stop until the truth is exposed." Sarah's expression hardened. For a moment, it looked as though she might lunge at him in anger, but she restrained herself. She turned to her lawyer, who seemed at a loss for words, then back to the judge. The anger on her face was palpable, but there was something else beneath it, a flicker of fear. "Judge Miller," Sarah said, her voice now a little more controlled, though still laced with tension. "This is a setup. That recording has been tampered with. I didn't say those things. I don't know who altered it, but it wasn't me. This is all lies." The courtroom was abuzz with murmurs at Sarah's sudden change of defense. Her denial was predictable, but the coldness with which she delivered it sent a chill through Ethan. He had been expecting her to fight back, but this was different. She wasn't just denying the truth. She was trying to manipulate the court into believing that everything had been fabricated. Ethan's mind raced. He had the recording, the bank statements, and the proof of everything Sarah had done. But now, he had to be careful. She wasn't going down without a fight, and the last thing he wanted was for her to twist the narrative in her favor. "Ms. Sarah," Judge Miller interjected, his voice now filled with authority. "We have listened to the recording, and it was played in full, without any interference. You have been presented with the evidence. You can choose to deny it, but it doesn't change the fact that the truth is out. Do you have anything to offer in your defense?" Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her face was flushed with anger, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. For a moment, it seemed like she might crumble under the weight of the evidence. But then, just as quickly as the moment of vulnerability had come, she regained her composure. "No," she said coldly, her voice now steely. "You think you've won, But I'm not done. This isn't over. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. Sarah had just declared war on him and his father. But Ethan wasn't backing down. He had come too far to be intimidated by her threats. Judge Miller slammed his gavel down, signaling the end of the session for the day. "We will reconvene tomorrow," he said. "The evidence will be reviewed, and we will proceed with this case. Until then, please refrain from making any further outbursts." Ethan sat back down, his mind racing. He had just taken the first step toward bringing his stepmother's lies to light. But this was only the beginning. He could feel Sarah's presence looming over him, even as the room emptied out. She wasn't done, and neither was he. The battle was far from over. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Sarah as she stormed out, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. The tension lingered, thick and suffocating. Ethan remained seated, his gaze never leaving the spot where Sarah had just been. The words she'd spoken were still fresh in his mind, each one a reminder of how deeply embedded she was in the lies that had plagued his family for years. Despite her fury, Ethan knew that he had taken a crucial step forward. There was no turning back now. His father, Henry, sat beside him, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Henry hadn't said a word since Ethan had played the recording. His expression was unreadable, but Ethan could see the storm brewing in his father's eyes, the conflict, the disbelief, and the pain of finally learning the truth. Ethan turned to his father. "Dad, are you okay?" Henry blinked, his eyes glassy as he looked over at Ethan. I don't know, son. I didn't want to believe it. I never thought she would do something like this. But now everything makes sense." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of his father's words. For years, Henry had been under Sarah's influence, believing in the version of reality that she had carefully crafted for him. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the way Sarah had manipulated everything, including his father's trust. Ethan had watched it all unfold from the sidelines, helpless until he finally found the courage to confront the truth. "Dad, we can't let this slide," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We have to finish what we started. Sarah won't stop. She'll fight back, and she's already shown us that she has power. But we have to make sure that everything she's done is exposed. For your sake. For our family's sake." Henry sighed heavily, the burden of the situation weighing on him. "I know, son. I know. But I'm not sure how much more of this I can take. I just want things to go back to normal." Ethan reached over and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "I know it's hard, but this is the only way to make sure she never does this again. We can't let her control everything. Not anymore." Henry nodded slowly, the flicker of determination in his eyes returning. "You're right. We've come this far, and we can't stop now. But I want you to be careful, Ethan. Sarah won't go down without a fight." The judge's gavel had signaled the end of the day's session, but the courtroom buzzed with the aftermath of Sarah's outburst. Ethan could sense that something had shifted, not just in his family, but in the room itself. Everyone knew that the stakes had just been raised. Ethan's mind was racing. Sarah had shown her hand, but she was far from finished. He had expected resistance, but what Sarah had said in those final moments, it wasn't just anger. It was desperation. She wasn't trying to protect herself. She was trying to control the narrative, trying to intimidate him. And that, Ethan knew, was the sign of someone who had something to hide. As they made their way out of the courthouse, Ethan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. It wasn't just about proving Sarah's guilt anymore. It was about surviving what came next. Sarah had made it clear that she wasn't going down quietly, and the threats she'd thrown at him were nothing short of chilling. The next morning, Ethan woke up early, his mind still buzzing with the events of the day before. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's words were more than just empty threats. There was something behind them, something dangerous. As he paced around the kitchen, trying to sort through his thoughts, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. Ethan hesitated, then answered. "Ethan," the voice on the other end said. "It's Alex." Ethan's pulse quickened. His older half-brother, Alex, had been away at college for the past year, and they hadn't spoken much since then. Alex wasn't exactly close to Ethan, but they had shared a bond growing up. Still, Ethan wasn't sure what to expect from him now. "What's going on, Alex?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've been keeping an eye on things," Alex replied, his tone even, but with an edge that Ethan didn't like. "And I know what's been happening with Sarah." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? How do you know all this?" "I've been watching," Alex said, his voice lowering. "I don't trust her either, Ethan, and I've got some information that might help you." Ethan felt a mix of relief and caution. He wasn't sure how much he could trust Alex. He had been distant for so long, but right now, he was willing to take any help he could get. "What kind of information?" Alex hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's about the money, about the accounts she's been hiding. I've been going through some things, and I've found evidence that links Sarah to more than just this family's finances. There's a whole operation she's involved in, Ethan, and it's bigger than we thought." Ethan's stomach churned. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Alex made it real. "What kind of operation?" "I can't talk about it over the phone," Alex replied, "but I'll meet you later today. I think you're going to need all the help you can get if you're going to take her down." Ethan's mind raced as he hung up the phone. He had a new lead, and he wasn't going to waste any time. But something about Alex's voice, the urgency in it, made Ethan uneasy. There was more to this than just Sarah's manipulation. This went deeper, and Ethan was beginning to realize how dangerous it could be. Later that afternoon, Ethan met Alex at a local cafe, a place they had used to go when they were younger. It felt strange to be there now, knowing what they were about to discuss. Alex looked different, more serious, more distant. But there was also something in his eyes that told Ethan he wasn't playing games. "All right," Ethan said, as he sat down across from Alex. "What do you know?" Alex leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room before he spoke. "Sarah isn't working alone. She's got connections, powerful ones. And there's something else. Someone else. Someone who's been helping her cover up everything." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Who?" Alex pulled out a folder from his bag and slid it across the table. "I think this guy's name is Robert Cartwright. He's the one who's been helping her launder the money." Ethan opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. His heart sank as he saw the connections. Hidden accounts, shell companies, offshore transfers. Everything pointed back to Cartwright. "This is bad," Ethan muttered, looking up at Alex. "We need to find him. We need to bring him into the light, too." Alex nodded. "And we need to be careful, Ethan. This is bigger than just Sarah. It's a network, and if you're not careful, you could be walking right into a trap." Ethan sat back, the weight of what they were about to do hitting him. He had already exposed Sarah, but now it seemed like the battle was just beginning. The following day, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving too quickly. The evidence was stacking up against Sarah, but every step he took brought new dangers. The threat Sarah had made in court still echoed in his mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had been prepared for resistance, but what he hadn't anticipated was just how deep the deception ran. it wasn't just about Sarah. There were others involved, and they were watching every move he made. Ethan had barely settled into his seat in the courtroom when something unexpected happened. The doors at the back of the room opened with a loud creak, and a hush fell over the audience. All eyes turned toward the entrance, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat when he saw who walked through the door. It was Alex. Ethan blinked in disbelief. His older half-brother hadn't been in town for weeks, and he certainly hadn't been involved in the case. They hadn't even spoken much since Alex had left for college. Ethan hadn't expected him to be here today, not with everything that had been happening. Yet there he was, walking toward the front of the courtroom with a determined expression on his face. The crowd seemed to part as Alex made his way through the room. Ethan stood up instinctively, his eyes locked onto his brother's. Alex's presence felt like a sudden shift in the atmosphere, as if the ground beneath Ethan's feet had moved. He didn't know why Alex was here, but something told him it wasn't by chance. This wasn't a coincidence. Ethan's mind raced as Alex approached the front, his gaze flicking between him and Sarah. He could feel the weight of the situation. This was not just a family affair anymore. Alex had always been closer to their father, but now it seemed like the family dynamics were shifting. He couldn't help but wonder what had prompted Alex to show up at such a crucial moment. Alex paused at the front of the room, his eyes meeting Ethan's. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Alex cut him off. "I've been keeping an eye on things," Alex said, his voice low but clear enough for the room to hear. "And I know what's been going on." Ethan's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Alex didn't hesitate. "I know about the money, about the lies, about Sarah, and I've been watching how things are unfolding. You're not the only one who knows what's going on." Ethan was stunned. "You've been watching?" he repeated, disbelief creeping into his voice. "For how long?" "For months," Alex replied, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't trust Sarah from the beginning. I knew something was off, but I didn't have the proof until recently. I've been looking into it all, just like you, Ethan." The realization hit Ethan like a ton of bricks. Alex had been keeping tabs on the situation, working in the background to uncover the truth. All this time, Ethan had assumed he was alone in this battle, but now he realized that his brother had been silently watching, waiting for the right moment to act. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "So, what does this mean? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Alex hesitated before answering. "I wasn't sure who to trust. And to be honest, I didn't want to make things worse. But after seeing how things were going in court, I realized we needed to work together. We can't take her down alone." Ethan nodded, his mind racing with the implications. They had been going down this path alone for so long, but now they had a powerful ally. Alex wasn't just an ally. He was someone who had been watching the situation unfold from a different perspective, someone who could provide the missing pieces to the puzzle. "All right," Ethan said, his voice firm. "What do you know? What have you found?" Alex pulled out a manila folder from his bag, sliding it across the table to Ethan. The folder was thick, filled with papers and documents. Ethan opened it cautiously, scanning through the contents. There were bank statements, account records, and emails, everything pointing back to Sarah and the financial web she had created. But there was more. There were also references to a man named Robert Cartwright. "Who's this?" Ethan asked, his finger tracing the name on one of the documents. Alex leaned in closer. "He's the one who's been helping Sarah with the money laundering. I've traced some of his business dealings, and they go deep. Cartwright's got connections everywhere. Offshore accounts, shell companies, You name it. Ethan felt his blood run cold. He had suspected there was someone else involved, but this was different. Cartwright wasn't just a small-time player, he was part of a much larger operation. So what now? Ethan asked, his voice tense. We've got the proof, but we need to move fast. Sarah's not going to go down quietly, and neither is Cartwright. Alex nodded. I've already started reaching out to some people who might be able to help. We need to get the authorities involved, but we also need to be careful. This is bigger than just a family feud. This is organized crime, and if we're not careful, we'll be walking straight into a trap. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had known this was dangerous, but hearing it from Alex made it real. This wasn't just about exposing Sarah anymore. It was about dismantling a criminal network, and that meant they were up against something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Let's do it, Ethan said, determination hardening in his voice. We can't let them get away with this. We've come too far. Alex gave a short nod, his expression serious. I'll contact the people I know. We'll need backup, and we'll need it fast. As the two brothers sat in the cafe, finalizing their plans, Ethan couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. He had no idea how this was all going to unfold, but with Alex on his side, he knew they stood a better chance. The truth was out there, and now it was time to bring it into the light. But as they left the cafe, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was closing in fast. Sarah wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for her life. The days following the meeting with Alex felt like a blur. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to piece together everything he had learned. The evidence was there, but it was still scattered, incomplete. The more they dug into Sarah's finances and her connections to Robert Cartwright, the more they realized they were up against something far bigger than they had ever imagined. Alex had been hard at work behind the scenes, contacting people in his network, digging into the shady dealings that linked Sarah to Cartwright and his web of illegal operations. Each new discovery was more disturbing than the last. Ethan couldn't believe how deep Sarah's betrayal ran. She wasn't just hiding money from his father. She was part of a much larger operation, one that had been operating under the radar for years. One evening, as Ethan sat in his room going over documents, Alex called. Ethan picked up the phone immediately, his heart already pounding in his chest. Ethan, we've got more, Alex said, his voice tight with urgency. I've tracked down a few more accounts linked to Cartwright, and I think I've found a connection to some high-level figures. This isn't just some small-time operation. It's big. Really big. Ethan's pulse quickened. What do you mean? What have you found? There are names in these records, Alex continued. People who have connections to government officials, corporate leaders, powerful people. They've been using shell companies to launder money across multiple countries. This is a full-scale criminal network. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had known it was bad, but this? This was something else entirely. So it's not just Sarah? No, it's not just her, Alex said. Sarah's the middleman. She's been using her position to funnel money, but there's a whole system in place, and it's much more dangerous than we thought. Ethan's mind raced as he processed the information. If this was true, then they weren't just fighting against a corrupt stepmother anymore. They were up against a criminal syndicate with ties to the highest levels of power. He knew they had to expose it all, but the question was, how? How do we stop them? Ethan asked, his voice filled with determination. We have the evidence now, but they won't just let this go. Alex was silent for a moment. We need help. Real help. I've already contacted a few people who can assist us, people who are familiar with these types of operations. But we're going to need to be careful. If we go public with this, we risk exposing ourselves to even more danger." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "I know. But we can't let them get away with it. Not after everything they've done to Dad." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Ethan could hear Alex breathing heavily. He wasn't sure what Alex was thinking, but he knew one thing for sure. They had to act quickly. "We're not going to be able to do this alone," Alex said finally, "but I think I've got a plan. We need to meet with someone who can help us, someone who can make sure this whole thing doesn't blow up in our faces." Ethan's stomach tightened. He didn't want to involve more people than necessary, but if it meant bringing down Cartwright and his network, then he would do whatever it took. "Where do we meet?" "Tomorrow," Alex replied. "I'll send you the details. And Ethan, be careful. This is about to get much more complicated." The next morning, Ethan met Alex at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. As he sat down, he noticed that Alex seemed even more tense than usual. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes were scanning the room nervously. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Alex glanced around before answering. "Yeah, but this whole thing is spiraling out of control. I've been doing some digging on Cartwright, and the people involved in his operation, they're not just criminals. These people are dangerous, and they have a lot more resources than we thought." Ethan frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Alex said slowly, "that we're not just dealing with a couple of crooks here. Cartwright has connections in places we can't even imagine. The people he works with, they have the kind of power that could shut us down in an instant. If we're going to take them down, we need to be smart about it." Ethan felt the weight of his brother's words pressing down on him. He had known this would be dangerous, but hearing Alex speak so candidly about the risks made it all the more real. This wasn't just about exposing Sarah anymore. It was about survival. "We have to bring them down," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "We can't back down now." Alex nodded, his eyes hard. "I agree. But we need to take this slow. We can't just go charging in. We need to get the authorities involved, but we also need to make sure they're on our side. And that's where things get tricky. Cartwright's got people everywhere. We don't know who to trust." Ethan's mind was spinning. They had the evidence. They had the truth. But it felt like they were swimming in a sea of lies and corruption, with no clear way to break through. The people they were up against were too powerful, too well connected. The risk of exposure was higher than ever. "We'll need to be discreet," Ethan said, his mind racing as he thought through their options. "We can't make a public move until we know we have all the pieces. We can't let them know what we're doing until we have them cornered." Alex leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Exactly. We're in deep, Ethan. The walls are closing in. If we're going to pull this off, we need to be careful. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart." Ethan's hands trembled as he thought about everything that was at stake. His father's life, his family's future, the truth that had been buried for so long. He wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers now. "We'll get them," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "We'll make sure they pay for everything they've done." As Alex stood up, ready to leave, Ethan felt a strange sense of resolve settle over him. The road ahead was dangerous, but he knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back. This was about more than just taking down Sarah. This was about taking down a criminal network, and they were going to bring it to light, no matter the cost. Ethan couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that gnawed at him. Every new discovery he and Alex made brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought them closer to danger. The walls were closing in, and it wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about surviving long enough to expose it. He had never imagined that revealing Sarah's lies would lead him into the depths of a criminal network with connections in high places. Now, it felt like every move he made was being watched. The phone calls started first. Unfamiliar numbers, silent voicemails, disturbing messages left on his answering machine. At first, Ethan dismissed them as the usual intimidation tactics, empty threats from people like Sarah who would stop at nothing to protect their empire of lies. But when the messages grew more explicit, more menacing, Ethan realized just how serious the situation had become. One evening, as he was reviewing documents at home, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. He opened it with a mixture of curiosity and dread. "Stop digging, Ethan. You don't know what you're up against." His blood ran cold. The message was short, but the implications were clear. Someone knew what he was doing. Someone knew that he was getting closer to the truth. Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. He could feel the weight of the words pressing down on him. He had expected resistance, but this was different. This wasn't just a threat from Sarah. This was something bigger. He tried calling the number back, but it was blocked. The message had come from a burner phone, one that couldn't be traced. The anonymity made it all the more chilling. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Who was behind this? Had Cartwright and Sarah already caught wind of his investigation? Were they watching him? "Ethan?" His father's voice interrupted his thoughts. Henry stood in the doorway of the living room, looking concerned. Ethan quickly shoved his phone into his pocket, but his father had already seen the worry on his face. "Everything okay?" Henry asked, stepping into the room. He had been distant lately, his mind weighed down by the trial and the revelations that had come to light about Sarah. But there was no mistaking the concern in his eyes now. Ethan didn't want to involve his father in this any more than necessary. Henry had enough to deal with, but the truth was, Ethan couldn't keep this from him any longer. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore. This was bigger than anything they had anticipated. "I just got a strange message," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. "Someone warning me to stop investigating." Henry's eyes narrowed. "From who?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. It's from a blocked number, but I think it's someone connected to Sarah or Cartwright." Henry didn't respond immediately. He sat down across from Ethan, his face filled with concern. "Ethan, you need to be careful. This isn't just about family anymore. You're dealing with people who have no limits. They'll stop at nothing to protect their interests." Ethan stared at his father, the weight of his words settling heavily on him. "I know, Dad, but I can't stop. Not now. Not after everything we've uncovered." Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't want you to get hurt, son. I don't know how to protect you from something like this, but I know one thing. These people will do whatever it takes to bury the truth." Ethan knew his father was right, but there was no turning back now. Sarah's actions had already hurt their family enough. The lies, the manipulation, the financial deceit. It was all part of a much larger scheme, one that Ethan couldn't allow to go unpunished. He had to keep going. The next morning, Ethan received another text. This one was different. It was more direct, more threatening. "Leave this alone. You won't win. Your family won't survive this." Ethan's stomach tightened. The implications were clear. Whoever was behind this wasn't just threatening him, they were threatening his father and anyone else who stood in their way. It was a warning shot, and Ethan knew it. They were playing a dangerous game, but it wasn't just Sarah and Cartwright he had to worry about anymore. There were other forces at play, forces that wanted to make sure the truth stayed buried. As he read the message, his mind raced. How far were they willing to go to silence him? And how many more people were involved in this operation? Cartwright was just the tip of the iceberg. The people behind him were powerful, and they had resources that Ethan couldn't even begin to comprehend. He needed to act fast. He needed to gather everything he had before they found out what he was doing. And he needed to make sure that his family was protected. Ethan called Alex later that morning, his voice urgent. "We need to move faster. I just got another message. They're on to us." Alex's voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the tension in it. "I knew this was coming. It's only going to get worse from here, Ethan. We can't let them intimidate us into stopping. But we have to be smart. We need to get the authorities involved. But we can't do it until we have everything." "I know," Ethan replied, "but we're running out of time. Every day we wait, they're getting closer. And the longer we stay exposed, the more danger we're in." The next few days were a blur. Ethan worked quickly, gathering all the evidence they had on Sarah, Cartwright, and the financial network they had uncovered. He didn't know how much longer they had before everything came crashing down, but he was determined to make sure that the truth was exposed. At the same time, the threats kept coming. He received more cryptic messages, more warnings, and it was clear that whoever was behind this was watching his every move. He couldn't let his guard down for a second. Every phone call, every meeting, every conversation felt like it could be his last. But even as the danger escalated, Ethan knew there was no turning back. He had to expose Sarah. He had to take down Cartwright's network. And he had to do it before they silenced him and his family for good. The days felt like they were slipping away, each one dragging Ethan further into a tangled web of lies and threats. Every move he made seemed to tighten the noose around him and his family. The more evidence he uncovered, the closer they got to bringing down Sarah and her powerful network. But with each passing hour, the danger increased. He could feel it. Someone was always watching. The messages had stopped being just warnings. They were now promises of what would happen if he didn't stop. Ethan tried to remain focused. He and Alex had met several times over the past week, going over every detail, making sure they had everything they needed before they approached the authorities. They were playing a dangerous game, and if they didn't time it right, it could all fall apart. They had no choice but to move quickly. The night before the trial resumed, Ethan lay awake, his thoughts spinning. He couldn't stop thinking about the messages, the threats, the chilling realization that his family was in far deeper than he had initially thought. He knew Sarah had orchestrated much of the chaos, but there were others too, people with power, influence, and a network of resources ready to shield them. What would happen to his father? What would happen to Alex and him? When the trial reconvened the next morning, Ethan felt the weight of the moment. The courtroom was filled with familiar faces, attorneys, reporters, and a few curious onlookers. But the air felt different now. There was an unspoken tension, a sense that the truth was hanging just out of reach, ready to shatter everything. As the proceedings began, Ethan's heart raced. He knew today was the day when everything would come to a head. The evidence they had gathered, bank transactions, secret emails, offshore accounts, was ready to be presented. But in the back of his mind, the growing sense of dread lingered. Sarah hadn't backed down, and from what he'd seen of her in the last few days, she was preparing for war. Sure enough, just as expected, Sarah entered the courtroom, flanked by her lawyer. The woman who had once been so confident now walked with a slight tremor in her step. Her face was pale, her eyes constantly darting around the room, but the mask of confidence she wore was still there. She wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. Ethan couldn't help but watch her as she made her way to the front. Sarah's eyes met his for a split second, and for the first time, He saw a flicker of fear in them. It was subtle, but it was there. She knew what was coming. She knew this was the beginning of the end for her. When the judge called the session to order, Ethan felt a cold chill run down his spine. His hands were clenched tightly on the table in front of him, but his resolve was unwavering. He had done everything he could to prepare for this moment. He couldn't turn back now. The prosecutor stood up and began to lay out the evidence, presenting the documents Ethan and Alex had carefully gathered. Ethan's eyes flicked between the evidence and Sarah, watching her reaction closely. She remained stoic, but there was an edge to her calmness now. It wasn't the same as the self-assuredness she had once carried. This was a woman who knew she was losing control. As the prosecutor presented the financial records and emails that exposed Sarah's ties to Robert Cartwright and his network, the room grew more and more tense. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Sarah's defense team, once so confident in their ability to protect her, now seemed visibly shaken. They didn't have an answer for the damning proof laid out before them. But just as the momentum was swinging in Ethan's favor, Sarah's lawyer stood up, interrupting the proceedings. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice trembling slightly but still authoritative, "we object to this evidence. It is inadmissible. These documents have been tampered with. They are not valid." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Sarah's defense was now grasping at straws. They were trying to undermine everything they had worked for. The judge, looking uncomfortable but composed, glanced down at the papers in front of him. "Mr. Anderson," Judge Miller said, addressing Sarah's lawyer, "are you implying that these documents are forged?" Sarah's lawyer straightened, his face flushed with determination. "Yes, Your Honor. We believe that these documents have been manipulated in some way to fabricate this entire case against my client." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Ethan could feel the tension building again. He had expected Sarah to fight back. But this felt desperate. Ethan looked over at Sarah, her face flushed with anger now. The woman who had been so composed earlier was visibly cracking. But the real threat wasn't her defense lawyer's objections, it was Sarah herself. Without warning, Sarah shot to her feet, her chair screeching against the floor. Her voice rang out across the room, cutting through the chaos. "This is a setup!" Sarah yelled, her eyes wild with fury. "This is all lies! Ethan has been trying to destroy me from the moment he found out the truth. You can't believe a word he's saying." The outburst shocked everyone in the courtroom. Ethan could feel the weight of Sarah's anger as she pointed directly at him, her hands shaking. "He's lying! All of this evidence, it's fabricated! I didn't do any of this!" Ethan stood frozen in place, his mouth dry. For a moment, it seemed as though Sarah was on the verge of losing complete control. But then, as quickly as the outburst had started, Sarah regained her composure. She took a deep breath and stood taller, her eyes locking onto the judge. "I will not let you ruin everything I've worked for," she spat. "I won't let you tear this family apart. I'm innocent. All of this. It's just an attack on me." Ethan's hands were clenched at his sides. He could feel his anger rising, but he kept it in check. He knew Sarah was trying to turn the tables, to make herself the victim, but he wasn't going to let her. He had the truth on his side. And now, it was time to finish what he had started. Judge Miller banged his gavel, calling for order in the court. "Ms. Sarah," he said sternly, "you will refrain from making such outbursts. If you continue, I will have you removed from this courtroom." Sarah's face twisted with fury, but she didn't speak again. The judge turned to the prosecutor, signaling for the next phase of the trial to continue. Ethan exhaled, trying to steady his racing heart. He had expected Sarah to fight back, but this was different. She was desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. Ethan couldn't let his guard down now. He had come too far to let her take everything back. The trial continued, but as Ethan sat there, watching the evidence stack up against Sarah, he knew one thing for sure. This was the beginning of the end for her. She had exposed herself, and now the truth would come to light, no matter how hard she tried to deny it. The trial was in full swing, and the tension in the courtroom had only intensified. Ethan sat at the edge of his seat, his heart pounding in his chest as the evidence mounted against Sarah. Every document, every email, every bank statement exposed her lies and her connections to the criminal network that had been operating under the surface for years. And yet, Sarah wasn't backing down. Her outbursts, her denials, and her manipulation were all designed to throw the truth into question. But it was too late. The walls were closing in. The prosecutor had just finished presenting a crucial piece of evidence, a series of emails that linked Sarah directly to Robert Cartwright, the mastermind behind the money laundering operation. Ethan could feel a wave of relief wash over him as the prosecutor laid out the final connections, showing how Sarah had been funneling money through offshore accounts and shell companies. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But just as the prosecutor was about to call for the final round of witness testimony, something unexpected happened. The doors to the courtroom suddenly burst open, and a man walked in, an older man with a calm, collected demeanor. His presence was almost magnetic. All eyes in the room shifted toward him, and Ethan felt a sudden rush of confusion. Who was this man? And why was he here? The judge paused, looking toward the man who had entered. "Can I help you, sir?" Judge Miller's voice was stern, but there was an air of curiosity in his tone. The man nodded, walking toward the front of the room. He was tall, his suit impeccably tailored, and he moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice calm and authoritative, "I have information regarding this case that I believe may be crucial to uncovering the full truth." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know this man. In fact, he hadn't seen anyone who even resembled him in all the months of investigation. But the way the man carried himself, so sure of his place in the courtroom, made Ethan uneasy. The judge raised an eyebrow. "And who exactly are you?" "My name is Vincent Collins," the man replied, his gaze never wavering from the judge. "I'm an investigator working with a federal agency. I've been tracking a series of financial transactions linked to Robert Cartwright and his network for quite some time. It appears this case is just the tip of the iceberg." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This was unexpected, far beyond anything he had anticipated. Could this man be someone who had been investigating Cartwright independently of him? Had he known about the criminal network all along? "I have reason to believe," Vincent continued, "that the full extent of Cartwright's operations stretches far beyond this family, and includes several high-profile individuals, including some people you wouldn't expect to be involved." His gaze briefly flicked toward Sarah, and for a moment Ethan thought he saw something resembling disdain in his eyes. "I have documents and evidence that could change the direction of this trial, if you'll allow me to present them." Judge Miller seemed taken aback by the sudden appearance of this stranger, but after a brief moment of contemplation, he nodded. "Very well, Mr. Collins. You may proceed, but please be brief. We are in the middle of a trial." Vincent Collins opened a briefcase that he had brought with him, his movements deliberate and precise. As he flipped open the case, Ethan felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. What had this man uncovered that could turn the tide in the trial? Was this an ally, or was this some kind of last-ditch effort by Sarah's people to derail the case? The investigator pulled out a series of documents, photographs, and financial records. These are copies of conversations, email threads, and transaction records that tie Sarah Williams directly to the laundering network run by Robert Cartwright. Vincent began, his tone even. But there's more. This isn't just about money. It's about the political and corporate influence Cartwright has been using to cover his tracks for years. Ethan's eyes widened as he glanced over the documents. There were photographs of high-level business meetings, names he recognized, politicians, CEOs, influential people, all intertwined with Cartwright's operations. It was more than just financial fraud. This was a global web of corruption. And, Vincent added, these documents show that not only was Sarah involved, but she's been covering for several others who are key players in this network, people who have been pulling the strings behind the scenes. The room was silent as the weight of Vincent's words hung in the air. Ethan couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about Sarah. This wasn't just about exposing one woman's deceit. This was bigger, much bigger. The people who had been operating in the shadows, pulling the strings, were now in the spotlight. Sarah's face had turned ashen. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a look of panic that was impossible to hide. She was visibly shaking, and her lawyer, who had been standing beside her, took a step back, clearly unsure of how to handle this new turn of events. Ethan turned to Alex, who was sitting beside him. Alex's eyes were wide with shock, and Ethan could feel the tension radiating from his brother. They had thought they were uncovering the whole story, but now it seemed like they had only scratched the surface. Judge Miller finally spoke, his voice firm and filled with authority. "Mr. Collins, I'll admit, your evidence is compelling. But can you explain how this ties directly to the defendant? We are here to investigate Sarah Williams and her involvement in these transactions." Vincent nodded, his eyes never leaving Sarah. "I can," he said simply. "Sarah Williams has been acting as the middleman, funneling money and laundering it through shell companies. She's been the point of contact for Cartwright and his associates. She's not just a passive participant. She's an active member of the operation." Sarah's lawyer opened his mouth to object, but Judge Miller silenced him with a sharp wave of his hand. "Your objections are noted, but the evidence will be considered. Mr. Collins, continue." Ethan sat in stunned silence as the investigation unfolded before his eyes. This was the break they had needed, the one that would expose the full scale of the operation. But even with this new information, Ethan knew that they were still only scratching the surface. The real danger hadn't even begun to reveal itself. Vincent Collins handed the judge a final piece of evidence, a hidden ledger that linked Sarah to multiple high-profile transactions, including several that had been funneled through political connections. As the judge examined the records, Sarah's entire defense crumbled in front of her. Her lawyer had no response, no way to explain the damning evidence that now lay bare in the courtroom. "I believe," Vincent said, his voice cutting through the tense silence, "that these documents not only prove Sarah Williams's involvement, but also connect her to a much larger, far-reaching conspiracy. A conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of business and politics." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air had thickened with the gravity of the moment. For the first time in the entire trial, it seemed like victory was within reach. But as Ethan looked at Sarah, he could see something in her eyes, a flicker of rage, of desperation. This wasn't over. Not yet. The courtroom was abuzz, and the weight of the new evidence dropped like a bomb. Everyone had expected the trial to conclude soon, but now, with the revelation that Sarah had been more involved than anyone could have imagined, the game had changed entirely. Sarah's world was crumbling around her, piece by piece, as the truth came to light. Yet even as the courtroom buzzed with murmurs and shocked glances, Ethan knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He glanced at his father, Henry, who was sitting beside him, his face pale but resolute. For years, Henry had been oblivious to Sarah's manipulation, blinded by his love for her. But now, as the walls closed in on Sarah, Ethan could see that the anger, pain, and betrayal were finally beginning to hit home. Ethan reached out and placed a hand on his father's shoulder, offering a silent reassurance. It wasn't just about exposing Sarah anymore. This was about their family, about putting the pieces of their lives back together after the chaos Sarah had unleashed. But as the prosecutor continued to present evidence, Ethan couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was wrong. The last few days had felt like a whirlwind, each step closer to the truth, but each step bringing more danger. Sarah hadn't given up, and neither had her associates. Ethan knew that the real fight was only just beginning. Then came the unexpected. Just as the prosecutor was about to call their final witness, the doors to the courtroom burst open once again. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see who had entered. It wasn't another investigator or lawyer. This time, it was someone much more familiar. It was Robert Cartwright. Ethan's blood ran cold as the man walked into the courtroom with a sense of arrogance that was unmistakable. He was flanked by a team of bodyguards, and his smug expression sent a chill through Ethan's entire body. He had been expecting Cartwright's involvement, but seeing him here, in the flesh, was something entirely different. Cartwright wasn't just a distant figure anymore. He was here, present, making a statement. The judge, who had been taken aback by the sudden intrusion, quickly regained his composure. "Mr. Cartwright," Judge Miller said, his voice now colder than before, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a court of law, and you do not have authorization to be here." Cartwright didn't seem fazed. His cold eyes scanned the room, locking onto Sarah. "I believe I'm well within my rights to be here," he said smoothly, his voice carrying authority. "This is my business, after all." The courtroom fell into complete silence. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Cartwright took a few deliberate steps toward the front, his gaze flicking to Ethan and then back to Sarah. His presence was like a shadow, darkening everything it touched. "Your Honor, if I may," Cartwright continued, "I'm here because I believe this trial is based on a series of misunderstandings, a few accusations here and there, perhaps not entirely correct, but certainly misrepresented." Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. Cartwright wasn't even pretending to be innocent. He was brazen, as though his presence in the courtroom was a power play. It was clear that he was trying to take control of the narrative, to intimidate the court into believing that he was untouchable. Ethan stood up, unable to contain the surge of anger and disbelief. "What are you doing here, Cartwright?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the silence. "You've been hiding behind Sarah for too long. You're not above the law." Cartwright's icy smile didn't falter as he turned his gaze toward Ethan. "I'm here because this isn't just about your family. This is about far more than you could ever understand, young man. Your little investigation has become a nuisance, and it's time to put an end to it." The words hit Ethan like a slap in the face. He knew Cartwright had power, but this? The arrogance and sheer audacity of Cartwright standing in front of him, making it clear that he believed he was untouchable, was almost too much to bear. Judge Miller cleared his throat, raising his gavel. "Mr. Cartwright, this is a courtroom, not a stage for your theatrics. You will leave immediately, or I will have you removed." But Cartwright wasn't done. "I think," he said, his voice now much colder, "you'll find that it's not so easy to remove me. You're playing with fire, Ethan. You've opened a door, And once it's open, there's no going back. This whole trial? It's a distraction. What you think you know, what you think you've uncovered, has only scratched the surface. Ethan's blood ran cold. Cartwright wasn't just threatening him, he was warning him that whatever he thought he had uncovered, it was nothing compared to what was coming. "Mr. Cartwright," Judge Miller said sharply, his patience wearing thin, "I've given you enough leeway. Leave now, or I will have you escorted out of this courtroom." Cartwright didn't even flinch. With one final glance at Ethan, he turned on his heel and walked out of the courtroom, his bodyguards trailing behind him like shadows. The doors slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing. Cartwright had just made his move, and it was clear that he wasn't just a player in this game. He was the kingpin, the one pulling the strings. And now that he had made his presence known, Ethan knew that the fight was about to escalate. The prosecutor, visibly rattled by Cartwright's interruption, quickly regained control. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "I ask that the court proceed with the trial. The evidence we've presented speaks for itself. We have the proof that Sarah Williams was directly involved in the criminal activities of Robert Cartwright and his network." Judge Miller, still recovering from the disruption, nodded curtly. "We will proceed. Mr. Ethan, I understand you have further evidence to present?" Ethan, still reeling from the confrontation with Cartwright, nodded. His mind was racing, but his resolve was clear. He couldn't stop now. They were so close. But the reality of what Cartwright had said, the door they had opened, was starting to sink in. Cartwright was not just a criminal. He was a force. And if he could intimidate the court this easily, who knew how far he would go to protect his empire? But one thing was certain. Ethan was no longer afraid of him. He had come too far, and now it was all or nothing. The truth was within reach. And no matter how deep this rabbit hole went, Ethan was going to expose it all. The trial had reached its boiling point. After Cartwright's abrupt interruption, the tension in the courtroom had only grown. Ethan's pulse raced as the reality of what they were up against started to fully sink in. Cartwright wasn't just some criminal mastermind. He was someone who could bend the law to his will, intimidate those who tried to stand in his way, and manipulate everything around him. But now, for the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid. He had come too far to stop now, and with the truth on his side, he was ready for the final confrontation. Judge Miller had regained control, though the room still buzzed with the aftermath of Cartwright's visit. The prosecutor quickly moved forward with the presentation of additional evidence that tied Sarah even more securely to the criminal network. Ethan sat at the edge of his seat, trying to push aside the unsettling feeling that Cartwright's appearance had left in him. This was the moment. The truth was finally coming into focus. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, his voice steady despite the chaos that had unfolded moments before, "we have one last piece of evidence that will tie this case together. This will show beyond a shadow of a doubt that Sarah Williams is not just an accomplice, but a key player in a much larger operation, one that spans multiple continents." Ethan could feel the weight of the prosecutor's words. He knew this final piece would be the turning point. If they had any hope of bringing down Cartwright and exposing the full extent of the criminal network, this was it. The prosecutor handed over the final set of documents, a comprehensive list of transactions that linked Sarah to high-ranking officials across various industries, including politicians, corporate executives, and law enforcement officers. There was one name that stood out to Ethan, one he hadn't expected to see. It was a name from his own past, his mother's former business partner, a man named Samuel Grant. The connection between Sarah, Cartwright, and this powerful individual sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. The prosecutor laid the documents on the table. These transactions show that Sarah Williams was not simply managing money for Cartwright. She was actively facilitating these deals with multiple key players, including Samuel Grant. This man is not just a businessman. He is an influential figure who has played a central role in the operations of this network. Ethan's mind raced. Samuel Grant had always been someone his mother had trusted before her untimely death. He had been a pillar in the business community, respected, influential. To see his name connected to Cartwright and Sarah was nothing short of shocking. The web they had been unraveling was deeper than anyone had realized. Sarah's face had gone pale. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by an expression of pure terror. For the first time in the trial, she seemed to realize the full extent of what was happening. She had tried to control the narrative, tried to deny her involvement, but now the evidence was undeniable. I didn't, Sarah began, her voice shaky, but she was cut off by Judge Miller's sharp command. Enough, he said sternly. The evidence is clear. You have been actively involved in one of the most sophisticated criminal operations this court has ever seen. You are no longer in a position to deny your actions. The law has caught up with you. Ethan watched as Sarah's shoulders slumped. For the first time, there was no defiance in her. The woman who had manipulated his family, who had controlled his father and made his life a living hell, was finally facing the consequences of her actions. But just as Sarah appeared to crumble under the weight of the evidence, a chilling voice cut through the courtroom. You think this is enough to take me down? Ethan's heart sank. He knew that voice. It was Cartwright. He had returned, pushing his way past security, flanked by his men in dark suits. He stood in the doorway, his eyes burning with malice as he glared at Ethan and the rest of the courtroom. Mr. Cartwright, you're under no circumstances allowed to be in this courtroom, Judge Miller said, his voice booming with authority. Leave now, or I will have you removed. Cartwright smiled, though it wasn't a smile that offered any comfort. You think you can do anything to stop me? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Ethan stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. You've controlled everything for too long, Cartwright. But not anymore. We have the evidence. We're bringing you down, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Cartwright's smirk faltered for just a moment, but then he recovered, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate pace. You really think this will be enough? You think the truth you've uncovered will destroy me? You have no idea what's at stake here. People like me, people with power and resources, don't go down so easily. I don't care how powerful you think you are, Ethan retorted. The truth is coming to light, and we're not backing down, not anymore. Sarah, still trembling in her seat, cast a desperate glance at Cartwright. Robert, you have to help me. You can't let them win. You have to get me out of this. But Cartwright didn't respond. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the exit, his bodyguards flanking him. This isn't over, Ethan, Cartwright said coldly. I'll make sure you regret this. With that, Cartwright and his men left, the doors slamming shut behind them, leaving an eerie silence in the courtroom. The weight of the moment settled over Ethan like a wave. Cartwright had made his move, but Ethan knew it was too late. They had the evidence. They had the truth. It was only a matter of time before the entire criminal network would come crashing down. And Sarah? She was finished. There was no escaping the truth now. Judge Miller stood, raising his gavel. This court will reconvene in 1 hour. The evidence will be reviewed, and the final verdict will be delivered. Ethan stood still for a moment, taking in the enormity of what had just transpired. His mind was still processing everything: the threats, the intimidation, the magnitude of the criminal operation they had uncovered. But now, for the first time in years, he felt a sense of relief. The truth was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was out in the open. Turning to his father, Ethan saw the mix of emotions on Henry's face: shock, pain, and something else: guilt. But there was also a glimmer of hope. For the first time, Henry saw Sarah for what she truly was, and that was a victory in itself. Ethan wasn't done. The fight wasn't over. But today, they had won. And that was all that mattered.